So this should be going live. It says streaming quality is very good. I hope the audio quality and video quality match my expectations. I apologize if this is still a little bit improvised because I haven't been working with OBS for a while, so maybe some of my settings don't work properly as I connect it to a TV. That doesn't matter anymore. This is Mark Tech. I am back, guys. My voice is back. My voice has been gone for so long. So I'm actually really excited to break it once again midstream. But seriously, I know that some of you have been waiting for content. I know some of you couldn't care less about it, but I still appreciate everybody who will join, which at this point is an incredible zero viewers, but that doesn't matter to me. We are growing, and there's only one way to go up when you're at zero. This is Mark Tech reacting to the new introduction of the MacBook Pro and Mac Mini, now featuring M2 chips. Now, this isn't the biggest upgrade ever in Apple's history, and this is kind of like the M2 iPad Pro, I would wager. But I want my reaction primarily to focus on what I think about it, obviously, what it is, right? We do want an objective fact basis. And then I want to talk about what it means for Apple both in the near future and in the long term. I think the near future in this case is almost more exciting than the long term, which usually it's kind of the other way around. But let's get started. So right on Apple's homepage, we will use a little bit of 95 Mac and Mac rumors down the road, but for now we are at Apple, the most official source, and we do have here both the MacBook Pro mentioned and the Mac Mini. I'm sorry if my scrolling is a little weird. I don't know why it does that. Doesn't matter. Yeah, I'm gonna scroll like that. Um, Tell me, guys, if those of you who are watching, if like the bitrate for you is a little low, if the quality is suffering. I'm trying to stream in 4K, but I might turn it down to like either 1440p or 1080p in the future. Otherwise, obviously, the video will be in higher quality once it's uploaded later. Okay, so we do have the MacBook Pro, which stars the M2 Pro and the M2 Max chips, and the Mac Mini. I think the Mac Mini is more interesting because more changes, both in features and in price. So we are gonna click on Learn More. Now, very important here is the fact that the Mac Mini now finishes its transition to Apple Silicon, which leaves only the Mac Pro basically left still on Intel chips. And Apple does that by both updating the previous M1 Mac Mini to the M2 and updating the previous Intel higher end Mac Mini to the M2 Pro chip. Not quite the M2 Max, but it's still a nice change. So they're saying everything will get done faster, it takes everything to a whole new level, and that it's basically supercharged by those chips. Now, what's important? Well, the M2 chip is the same as the M2 chip in the MacBook Air. Why is that important? Well, because many people have been a little disappointed by that chip, and especially in like the iPad Pro, some people were like always arguing about how useful it even is. But on Macs, obviously, the power is much more utilized. Now, we are still talking about an 8-core CPU, which means we are going now from, which means we are still keeping 4 high-performance cores and 4 high-efficiency cores. And we are upgrading to a 10-core GPU from M1's 8 cores, which is similar to how the A14 went from a 4-core GPU to the A15 went to a 5-core GPU. Next, it's very important to consider that the RAM configuration is the same, which also means that peak memory bandwidth is the same. So Apple still uses probably LPDDR5 and not LPDDR5X, which is very new. It kind of just came out like last month into volume production by Samsung. So it's very similar to 3 nanometer. It isn't very realistic for it to yet be here, but it would have made an improvement. And then obviously the M2 Pro is a bigger version. It's similar to how the M1 Pro obviously scaled up from the M1. It has 8 high performance cores and now 4 high efficiency cores. That is in comparison to the M1 Pro that only had 2 high efficiency cores, which kind of balanced it more towards performance than it did with the M2 chip. So having 4 cores here is nicer, and we are going to get to efficiency and battery life a little more once we talk about the MacBook Pro. Now the M2 Pro stays at a maximum of 32 gigs of unified memory, and similar, it has the same peak memory bandwidth as the M1 Pro did. Gonna check it real quick, guys, here. Yeah, the video works. The chat should work too for all of you who are interested. I think we now have 1 viewer, but obviously that doesn't matter. I'm happy for anybody who tunes in, and let me know, the 1 person for now, if the video and audio quality is acceptable to you. So next, now we have talked about basically the chips that are new, right? And very funny here is that we do have an announcement to watch, which is like a 15-minute video that is very keynote style, even with like a transition similar to Apple's usual videos. And to me, that means one thing. This was planned for an actual event, an actual video, obviously. And they just scrapped the overall keynote, probably because the headset, the much rumored AR mixed reality headset, was delayed once again, probably to a March event, maybe until WWDC. So they still had to launch this because it was ready. And quite honestly, it might not be that market appealing in 6 months, right? If they launch it then. So let's continue. So we've talked about obviously the chip configuration. Apple compares it still primarily to the Intel-based Mac Minis. Apple's comparisons usually are pretty fair. I know that they got a lot of flack for like their vague charts, but here are like some Photoshop comparisons, image upscaling. 24 times faster than the Mac Mini with a Core i7, the last one they had. That is obviously, I don't know, it's, this one partially utilizes the neural engine, which also means that it's going to be faster than the M1, disproportionate to the CPU and GPU increases that we see. But obviously the GPU is also has seen a nicer uplift than the CPU in this case, just like it did with the M2 over the M1 in the MacBook Air and the iPad Pro. So when we go here, this is video editing. Video editing obviously depends on the codec that you're using, and the M2 now has Apple's ProRes encoding, so it will deliver even a nice uplift over the M1, but it should still be faster also for H.264 and H.265. Still no AV1 encoding because this is basically the same chip as the M2, and the M2 Pro is just a larger version. From what we understand, there are no significant new IP blocks in terms of either ray tracing accelerated hardware or anything else like that. So what do we have else? We have video transcoding, also much faster. Interesting, that shows a very nice uplift over M1, but they are using ProRes, so this is kind of a test in their favor. Code compiling, this is a multi-threaded task, so M2 Pro with its higher amount of cores will do nicely here, and then the M2 is still a little faster than the M1, about like 19-20% it's supposed to be in terms of CPU performance. And productivity, they're using Excel. That's also a CPU task. Kind of very similar uplift here. And also not quite a gigantic one over something like the Core i7. So Yeah, that's also what we do. We do have the compact 7.7-inch square frame, still the use of unified memory. They do say it's fast SSD storage, but I do not quite know what the configurations will be. If there is a chance that we will see a similar situation like on the M2 MacBook Air, which saw its SSD speeds reduced because it went from using two storage modules to using just one. So that is a little bit of an unknown factor. Then Apple keeps advertising its versatility, including gaming. Now we are getting a few more games now on Macs, but obviously it's still nothing crazy yet. Um, Obviously, Resident Evil Village and No Man's Sky are kind of the poster childs, and I think we are gonna see more at this year's WWDC. Audio and video production, software development. Again, nothing fundamentally changes over the M1, but and this is why the Mac Mini, in my opinion, is very interesting this time, is because when you look here, this is the M2, which has the same connectivity as before, which also means it still has HDMI 2.0 and two Thunderbolt 4 ports, while the M2 Mac Pro gets two extra Thunderbolt 4 ports, so now four of them, and it upgrades to an HDMI 2.1 port. Now, HDMI 2.1 port is very nice for anybody who wants to connect to um, a higher refresh rate external monitor, especially once you go 4K and above. And now you can go as high as 4K 240 hertz or 8K 60 hertz. So that's quite a nice upgrade. So I'm gonna check if everything still works. Yeah, it's supposed to. Good. We also have an update to Wi-Fi 6E, similar to what the iPad Pro got. That's very nice. Apple advertises up to 2.4 gigabits per second throughput. Obviously, that will still depend on your network, and with a more productivity focused machine, you might actually prefer just connecting it through Ethernet. But who knows? Especially for peer-to-peer connectivity, this is still a nice upgrade. Then Apple's accessories, this like the Studio Display, the Magic Keyboard, Trackpad, and Mouse. All nice devices, nothing crazy in terms of upgrades, obviously, for them. And the Studio Display, in my opinion, is still overpriced. So let's look at tech specs. And that's where we'll see the first major change, and that is that the M2 Mac Mini starts at $599 versus the M1 Mac Mini, which started at $100 more. That is very nice. Now, the storage upgrade prices are still a little crazy, so we do have to pay $200 to get to 500 gigabytes. But I will say that actually at $800, getting an M2 device with 512 gigabytes of storage, and then maybe you upgrade for like another 200 to a full grand and get 16 gigabytes of RAM, I actually think that's really nice. It's kind of difficult for me to not recommend it for like anybody who really wants a Mac in their life, and maybe they don't have a use for a MacBook Air, which then I would obviously recommend that instead. Then we can configure it to the M2 Pro, which starts at $1299. It starts with a 10-core CPU, so it has only 6 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. It has a 16-core GPU and a 16-core neural engine. That's important here to know. They all have the neural engine, which is 40% faster. And it obviously has double the peak memory bandwidth of the regular M2 chips. And it's configurable to the M2 Pro with a 12-core CPU and a 19-core GPU. Everything else stays about the same. So yeah, we do have the higher storage configuration options. Still think that 256 is a little bit too little. Kind of would have liked if they would have just kept the same starting price and upgraded it to 512 gigabytes. But that's obviously like wishful thinking. That being said, like the M2 chip is objectively more expensive. It's a larger chip on a slightly newer node, which means even at the same price per die, it is more expensive for Apple. So seeing a price reduction is actually quite nice. It's nothing groundbreaking, and it was probably needed to make the Mac Mini more popular, but I do think it's a good thing. So here we do still have like the 6K 60 hertz and 4K 60 hertz for the M2 version. And then for the M2 Pro, we now have support for up to 3 displays. 2 displays with up to 6K at 60 hertz, that's over the Thunderbolt ports. Up to 2 displays, 1 display with up to 6K at 60, and 1 display with up to 4K at 144 hertz over the HDMI. So it does use HDMI 2.1 and display stream compression, obviously. And I'm sorry, that is the extra button on my mouse that I still am kind of uncomfortable in using. And then you can support up to 1 display with up to 8K resolution at 60 Hz or 4K resolution at 240 Hz over the HDMI port. So that is actually a very, very nice upgrade. It still has support for all the relevant HDR standards like Dolby Vision, HDR10, and HLG. Audio, this is still one of Apple's devices with a 3.5mm headphone jack. When we look at connectivity, again, Ethernet is 1 gigabits per second, but can be upgraded to 10 gigabits per second, and the USB-A ports are 5 gigabits per second. Again, Wi-Fi 6E, that is very interesting. It's across the board. I'm kind of surprised to see that. I almost expected that to be exclusive to the M2 Pro. But very nice, and a very nice value add, because also Wi-Fi 6E is an objectively more expensive component than Wi-Fi 6 antenna. Bluetooth 5.3, also an upgrade over before. Also worth mentioning that previous Mac Minis had some issues with Bluetooth connectivity, because obviously, like an all aluminum enclosure will block contact a little bit, but then you have like the plastic bag, which should let most of it through, like, but who knows, maybe they now have a much better Bluetooth antenna. They certainly had much better ones in the Mac Studio, so I'm kind of hopeful that they really went kind of all out here. So very nice device, not much obviously of note here, and it ships just with the Mac Mini and the power cord, which if you remember how like Steve Jobs pitched the Mac Mini, it was like, bring your own keyboard and mouse and display. This is basically like Apple's cheapest Mac, because it doesn't have that stuff. And when we go to order, oh my god, that's so bright. I apologize so much to anybody who just got blinded. So when we look at this, yeah, I see the stream has a little bit of a delay with the video. I'm gonna try fixing that next time, maybe connect it to Ethernet via an adapter. So we do have the price reduction here, but then I think the upgrade options are pretty much known there. I think more interesting here is with the M2 Pro, it starts with the 10-core and a 16-core GPU, and then you can upgrade it to a 12-core CPU and a 19-core GPU, which will obviously deliver the bulk of the performance upgrades over the higher end M1 Pro. But then again, the Mac Mini didn't used to have an M1 Pro, so this is still a nice upgrade for, I think, basically everybody. Let me first check here. Yeah, everything works. Please, guys, let me know if the stream works for you, or if the delay is basically unbearable, if I should change it to like lower latency. I now see that I do have to reduce resolution. I'm sorry, because I see a certain delay in the stream. I hope that this will be fixed by next time, and the next time will come sooner than last time. So what I wanted to say, that $300, it's kind of expensive as an upgrade here, but it's not completely unreasonable. Like, if you are somebody who's just into coding and wants to configure it, but then you are getting dangerously close to the Mac Studio. So we do kind of have the same discussion as we used to have with the M2 MacBook Air and the M1 Pro MacBook Air, a MacBook Pro. So Apple kind of plays again their games of like trying to upsell you, but I do not think that any of this is crazy. Like considering like the inflation that we had over the years, considering how Apple likes their margins, I actually think this is good. I would have liked for it to be like $100 cheaper as a starting price point. Obviously, $200 would have put it in an amazing value. But again, this is Apple we are talking about. Okay, guys, so we have talked about the Mac Mini, and the Mac Mini is awesome. But I think the main star of the show, even though it's technically less interesting, it's purely by virtue because it is the more popular device. I think the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro are the standout devices, and because they have the M2 Max in their higher end configuration. So let's start. We do have still like the usual $19.99 starting price. I'm saying usual, that's the new starting price with the M1 Pro and M1 Max devices. So the website's kind of lagging here a little. Yeah, so we do still have, just as on the Mac Mini, we do have a 12-core CPU and a 19-core GPU. But on the M2 Max, we obviously go to 38-core GPU. And similar to how the M2 now supports 24 gigs of RAM over the M1, the M2 Max supports 96 gigabytes versus 64, which is interesting because the M2 Pro didn't get an option for like 48 gigs of RAM, probably because Apple wants to upsell those people on the M2 Max. And given Apple's absurd memory pricing, it's kind of better to just get the fastest chip possible anyway, because the chip upgrades are much more reasonably priced than the memory upgrades. So, will Apple talk about the actual chips? Yes. So we have 40 billion transistors in the M2 Pro. That's 20% more than the M1 Pro and twice that of M2. So we do have kind of a linear scaling basically, and which is very interesting because this does use, and this was mentioned in Apple's video, the N5P node, or as they call it, the second generation 5 nanometer process. So this is an upgraded process over the N5 or first generation 5 nanometer process in the M1 Pro. But it's the same one as on the base M2, and it's kind of disappointing if you're really obsessed with that kind of stuff, because last month we got news that 3 nanometer would be going into mass production, but obviously mass production in December, especially now with Lunar New Year in China, would not go into any reasonable device in January or February, and likely not even March. So I'm kind of satisfied with still being on N5, now N5P, and very happy that Apple is giving us a larger chip. 40 billion is a gigantic processor by all accounts. So, we do have advertised of double the bandwidth of the M2 for the M2 Pro, and then the M2 Max doubles it again. But again, it's important to consider now with 67 billion transistors, 10 billion more than the M1 Max, is that that neither the M2 Pro or the M2 Max actually upgrade the peak memory bandwidth versus their predecessors. So there's no LPDDR5X usage or a new memory subsystem. Like there isn't a larger bus, for example. So what do we have? Okay, so Apple details again the core configuration, 12-core CPU, 19-core GPU. This is also interesting. This is not a linear upgrade. The M2 obviously goes to 10 cores, so this should be a 20 core configuration. And if we actually look at the layout, that's what it is. But it's important to consider that Apple likely bins those chips ever so slightly, so by one core here and by two cores here. I would be surprised if it's an asymmetrical layout and I just cannot see it here. But maybe somebody who knows more about this will correct me. I personally think it's just an ever so slight bin because the chip is larger and they just want to make sure that they can use as many of them as possible. That's like, for example, the 1490, even like the most expensive GPU currently on the market, does not use the full dice that it actually is supposed to use. So we do have the 16 core neural engine. So now we have the actual numbers. So what does Apple advertise? The M2 Pro and the M2 Max deliver up to 20% more CPU performance. That is interesting because the M2 delivered kind of like 18% uplift just through single core performance updates, while this advertises 20% more CPU performance and it has two more efficiency cores. So it is going to be interesting, like where Apple changes their clock speeds, like their peak clock speed is likely the same as. Somebody joined the chat. Hello, Masood. I'm just not gonna pronounce the name because I'm gonna butcher it, even though I have a lot of friends actually with similar names. So yeah, please let me know how the how the video and audio quality is, because I've kind of seen a delay when I look at the stream. So, but let me continue. So the M2 Pros and Max, they do have two more efficiency cores. And I do wonder how that affects multi-core performance. Those chips are obviously far less powerful than the performance cores, but I still would have expected more like 25% more CPU performance, which does lead me to conclude that probably peak single core performance for just one core is 3.5 gigahertz, or but that the other cores are very conservatively clocked at then at like around 2.8 gigahertz or something like that. It has 30% more GPU performance. Yep, makes sense. It has a little more cache. Not it doesn't utilize its GPU performance more through higher bandwidth. For example, like the M2 had higher peak bandwidth than the M1, which helped. So yeah, that is kind of interesting going to be to see like which tasks benefit more from like a higher cache versus higher single core performance in general. So, oh man, this website is so shy. Like, what's going on? So, like this. Does it not work? Or is it all that happens here? Oh, it's just basically a pop-up. Interesting. Yeah, sorry guys, got a little confused here. Yeah, so Apple does advertise 20% higher CPU, 30% higher GPU, and 40% higher neural engine faster neural engine. So yeah, and that is part of it because all the other upgrades basically continue where we have also been with like the Mac Mini, right? Like the displays are still the same, the audio system is still the same, the connectivity gets basically the same upgrades, and we do have performance comparison to the previous Intel version, but that again is not a high priority for me to even like take seriously, because obviously over time chips progress. The newest Intel Core chips on like 13th gen are also much faster than this. So what matters to me more is the upgrade over the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. But we do still see that if you were, for example, on like an M1 Max, you cannot really like side grade to an M2 Pro and expect to get like big uplifts. In most tasks, you will likely see a downgrade. And the 16-inch model, obviously less thermally constrained than before, and it used to have the Radeon Pro 5600M, which was quite a nice card. So the uplifts are smaller versus the Intel/AMD MacBooks of the past. So very interesting to note is battery life. Now battery life is 1 hour longer than before. As far as I know. So we're gonna go quickly to the Mac Rumors page. Yes, so the new 16-inch MacBook Pro offers up to 22 hours of battery life, longest ever in the Mac. That's up from 21 hours. And the 14-inch model, which is what I use, for example, to do this stream, is increasing from 17 hours to 18 hours. That's really nice. I have to say, it is still a nice performance uplift and it gets better battery life. That's not really what we see usually in the Windows space, where most performance goes directly, like most battery life enhancements, most efficiency enhancements just go directly to more performance. Even cooling isn't like really like much work done, even though we now have like 5 nanometer chips from AMD. There, the laptops are still pretty large usually. So this is nice in my opinion. So what do they else mention? That it's a keynote style video. I agreed with that. And they removed the M1 Mac Mini and the Intel Mac Mini from the lineup. So they're basically talking about what I talk about. And if we go to the MacBook Pro itself, here what they mention, again, they summarize the same about the chips and the 96 gigs of RAM. And yes, it also does have an HDMI 2.1 port. So if we go to tech specs, that has been like a little bit of a concern for me previously. If we go to connectivity, oh, it's display here. So it does still have the same 4 external display support. And it does scale similarly to the Mac Mini with its support for 4K at 144 Hz, while other connections are running, and 8K 60 Hz, or one external display with 4K at 240 Hz. If we are using 3 external displays at a time. So that's really nice. I don't know if there is a noticeable upgrade to the SD slot. From what I understand, not. So it is going to be the same as the XC standard that it was previously. But if something changes in the next days or hours, I will either comment on it on Twitter. This isn't me like spreading false information. I simply don't know. I haven't seen it on any tech spec, and I haven't seen Apple mention it in their overview either. Like when you look at the overall website, right? Like there isn't. They're still advertised like 8 terabytes of storage, relatively silent usage, longer battery life, but overall this the same Liquid Retina XDR with ProMotion. I would like to mention this again. From what I understand, there is not an upgrade in peak brightness in regular usage. This brightness levels apply to HDR, so not to the regular display. So let me go back here. Let me look at the display. Yes, is this yes, in SDR brightness it is still 500 nits. That's a little bit disappointing. I love obviously my 14-inch MacBook Pro, but if there's one thing that I would have liked to be officially upgraded, and that's the SDR brightness to like at least 600 nits, more like 650 or 700. 500 nits kind of not always enough, and the battery is more than good enough to give up like 10, 15, or even 20% of it to get a little bit higher brightness. So that's a little disappointing. And again, guys, let me know if you find any mention of like changes regarding the SD card slot, or anything else. There is now a color matched USB-C to MagSafe 3 cable, just as we got on the M2 MacBook Air. And we do have obviously the different power adapters. For example, I do have the 96 USB-C power adapter, while the 16-inch goes up to 140 watts. If we go to order now, I'm just gonna check it quickly. Yeah, there is still the 67 watt version for like the lowest end configuration, the 1999 version. And the 16-inch starts at the same 24.99, comes with the faster 144 break across the board. Wait, what is in the 34.99 configuration? Oh, that's crazy expensive. It's 32 gigs of memory. It is 1 terabyte of storage. Okay, so it's basically my configuration, just like a generation newer. Okay, so this is most of it, right? If we go to the Mac Rumors site, they do still mention that it has like Wi-Fi 6E, and they say also more. What do they also mention as more? Yes, they obviously explained that Wi-Fi 6E operates on a 6 gigahertz band. They do mention the HDMI 2.1 port. Yeah, everything else seems to be about the same. Let us check what a 95 Mac gets. I'm gonna quickly update it. Yes, they do have a comparison with the battery life, which is nice. It is a 1 hour longer video playback. When we look at wireless web usage, it's also an hour longer. That's actually really nice, because that's percentage-wise a higher uplift than like from 17 to 18. Going from 11 to 12 is nice, and that's like the one thing where I always like played with the thought of maybe getting like a 16-inch version, but it just is like too nice to have the more compact device for me. You see my voice, while it is back, it is still not perfect. Like usually my voice would last much longer than this. I don't even know. Let me quickly check. Yeah, we are at 37 minutes in. I will wrap this up soon. I'm not gonna make this a 1 hour video, but it's still nice that my voice at least lasts this long, but usually it would easily last a full hour. So yeah, that is basically it. I've broken down the chips again. Apple Mac Rumors does have still a breakdown here, and they do bring up the same numbers. They also bring up the larger L2 cache. So yeah, yeah, that's worth mentioning. It has a new image signal processor, but we didn't see gigantic uplifts on the M2 MacBook Air based on like we didn't see big upgrades on the M2 MacBook Pro, the 13-inch version, versus the previous 13-inch version with the same 720p camera. Obviously, if you also update resolution, that is going to have a nicer effect. Well, here, this is the same 1080p camera as before. Also, a fun note, we didn't see the regular store go down. We saw Apple's business-to-business store page go down before this was upgraded. Maybe this was a bug, or maybe Apple is like testing out a way to bring down only part of its store pages going forward. But then again, this is just speculation. I simply do not know. So, and I wanted to talk to you about what this means for Apple in the near future and in the far future. Now, obviously, my thoughts about this should be pretty clear. I like it. Like I love the 14-inch MacBook Pro, so why should with the M1 Pro? So why shouldn't I love this? I know that some people will be like, "Oh, why isn't this 3 nanometer? Oh, why isn't this or that?" I disagree. I think partial upgrades are always needed. They are welcome. It does upgrade two of the things that I really wanted it to do, which is like newer Wi-Fi and newer HDMI standards. And then I think like sometime next year, we will see a gigantic uplift through 3 nanometer, a new CPU architecture, likely a new hardware accelerated ray tracing GPU architecture. We are going to see maybe even Wi-Fi 7 or some kind of other connectivity improvements, as Apple's devices also get updated to work nicely with their headset. But all of that is speculation. I think in the near term, this is exciting because it does show me that Apple is committed to upgrading their devices. And I think if it hadn't been for like all the chaos and shutdowns, that we would have seen these chips basically like 3 or 4 months earlier. And there would have been a chance that they would get delayed even further if like China hadn't opened up. So in the near term, I think it's very exciting to see Apple's continued dedication to Apple Silicon. And in the far future, I think everything is still on the line, right? We might see either Intel or AMD do amazing upgrades, or we might see Apple's efficiency go so far beyond that the others just aren't able to catch up. Kind of what is happening right now already. Like we do have like 5 nanometer chips and even like 4 nanometer GPUs on the Windows side, but the efficiency level is still not the same, especially for like higher performance chips. So, yeah, I like it. It's not a big update. I know a lot of people will like moan about it, similarly to how they did with the M2 in the MacBook Air. However, this will not be thermally constrained like on the MacBook Air. I know some people will like ask like, oh, what can you do with it that you weren't able to do with the M1 versions of those chips? And some things comes to mind like the much faster neural engine, which obviously Apple now has a lot of features in their software that are AI accelerated, like their freaking weather app to some degree uses the neural engine. Um, so this is not a big attack on, like, for me at least, on those chips, that they aren't like gigantic updates. They are what they should be given the node they're on, given the architecture they're on, and given the prices that those devices are priced at. Like it's the same price, which is actually really nice considering that the M2 MacBook Air was more expensive than the M1 version. So without higher storage or without more RAM, just with a new design that didn't improve much except for a better camera. These are still some of the best laptops you can buy. Those are like absolutely recommendations if you actually want a Mac. Similar now goes for the Mac Mini. The Mac Mini, I've been a little apprehensive about it because there was an M1 Pro, MacBook Pro, but um, now that it's gotten cheaper with the M2, and now that for anybody who really wants a nice desktop, small, high efficiency, almost silent device, I think the M2 Pro is very nice. And obviously, it doesn't take much from here to then consider the Mac Studio, which is exactly what Apple wants you to do. And that's why I'm a little sad that they didn't actually update the Mac Studio here. But that's probably because they don't yet have an ultra version. Like they don't yet have like the basically the interconnected M2 Maxes. But that's still speculation. We don't know. It might be super easy to just basically drag and drop those on what the M1 Ultra did, or more likely it needs like another 50 million in or 100 million in R&D to make it perfect. So that remains to be seen. We also don't know how good the scaling will be. The M1 Ultra had some scaling issues. This one now does have more cache. We don't know what like the data transfer between those chips, if that is going to be upgraded. So we will cross that bridge once we get there, and maybe we will get there. And that is my last note of today with the Mac Pro, which is, if I'm going to be really pedantic here and go to Mac, the MacBook Air is completely Apple Silicon. The MacBook Pro is completely Apple Silicon. The iMac, now in only one size, 24 inches, is completely Apple Silicon and one generation behind. The Mac Mini is completely Apple Silicon. The Mac Studio is a new device that was built around Apple Silicon. And the Mac Pro, which is rumored to be released in the same design and then maybe just be a little less upgradable, is supposed to get the M2 Ultra eventually. But obviously, right now it's based on an Intel Xeon chip. It can support a crazy amount of GPU upgradability, storage upgradability, but then again, it's also already outdated. It's like on PCIe 3.0. The Xeon chip here is like several generations old. It's just not a good device, especially for the crazy price points. So I do hope it will be next. So this was Martech reacting to the M2 and M2 Pro Mac Mini and to the M2 Pro and M2 Max MacBook Pro. Leave comments, leave likes, share with whoever you think would want to watch this. And I appreciate everybody who tuned in. We had like 7, 8 max concurrent viewers. We had 1 comment. And we do still have 1 viewer. So I appreciate especially that viewer, but I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. And I see you guys next time. Let me know in the comments what you like to see next. And the next video will come much sooner than previously. That I promise. This is Marc Tech tuning out. Thank you very much again.